The century did not announce itself with any particular sound. There was no bell, no sudden change in the color of the sky, no collective moment when people in Britain realized that something new had begun. For most, the first years of the 20th century felt almost identical to the last years of the 19th. Streets looked the same, houses stood where they had always stood, shops opened in the morning and closed in the evening. The rhythm of life continued without interruption, carried forward by habit rather than expectation. In small towns across England, Scotland, and Wales, the day began in much the same way it had for decades. The streets were narrow and often lined with rows of terraced houses, their brick faces darkened by coal smoke and weather. These houses were modest and closely packed, built for workers and their families, each one nearly identical to the next. From the outside, they offered little sign of individuality. Inside, however, each contained a private world shaped by routine, necessity, and quiet endurance. Mornings were marked by practical sounds, the opening of back doors, the scraping of coal into kitchen fires, the movement of boots across stone floors. The fire was the center of the house, both for warmth and for cooking. Kettles were placed on iron grates, bread was cut, tea poured, and simple breakfasts prepared. There was little variation. Food was not a subject of imagination, but of availability. Porridge, bread, dripping, tea, and occasionally bacon formed the core of daily meals. For many families, the father left early for work, walking to a nearby factory, dockyard, workshop, or railway depot. Some wore uniforms, others carried tools. The work itself was rarely discussed in detail. It was simply going to work, an activity that filled the day and returned tired bodies in the evening. Employment was not seen as a path to fulfillment, but as a requirement for survival. One worked because one had to. Women remained largely within the domestic space, managing households that demanded constant labor. Washing clothes was a full-day task, involving boiling water, heavy scrubbing, and long hours of drying. Floors were swept daily. Children were dressed, fed, and prepared for school. The domestic routine was relentless, repetitive, and largely invisible outside the home. It was not considered remarkable. It was simply how life was organized. Children, when not at school, occupied the streets. They played simple games with little equipment, skipping ropes, marbles, chalk drawings on pavements. There were no dedicated playgrounds in most towns. The street itself functioned as a shared space for social life. Adults passed through it on their way to work or market. Children claimed it for play. Neighbors observed one another from doorways and windows, aware of each other's habits, illnesses, and arguments. Markets were among the most visible public spaces of everyday life. On certain days of the week, town centers filled with stalls selling vegetables, meat, fish, cloth, and household goods. These markets were not places of leisure, but of necessity. Prices mattered. Quality mattered. People knew which stalls offered fair weight and which did not. Bargaining was common, though restrained by politeness and custom. The market was also a social space, though not in the modern sense. Conversations were brief and practical. News was exchanged in fragments: a neighbor's illness, a factory accident, a rumor of job cuts. There was little speculation about the future. Most conversation remained anchored in the present: what had happened, what was needed, what could be afforded. Railway stations stood at the edge of many towns, symbols of movement in a society that otherwise remained geographically stable. Trains connected small communities to larger cities, but for most people, travel was rare. The railway was used primarily for work, trade, and the movement of goods. A minority traveled for leisure. The majority used it for necessity. At the station, time was measured precisely. Clocks were mounted high on walls, schedules were printed and displayed. The railway introduced a discipline of time that affected daily life. Work shifts, deliveries, and appointments increasingly depended on fixed hours rather than flexible routines. Yet even this change felt gradual. People adjusted without recognizing it as a transformation. Passengers waiting on platforms stood quietly, often alone or in small groups. Conversation was minimal. Travel was not yet associated with excitement or self-discovery. It was uncomfortable, slow, and often crowded. Carriages were divided by class. First-class compartments were upholstered and relatively quiet. Third-class compartments were crowded, noisy, and smelled of coal smoke and damp clothing. Class, though rarely discussed directly, structured nearly every aspect of life. Where one lived, how one dressed, what one ate, and where one worked were all determined largely by social position. Movement between classes was possible but uncommon. Education offered some opportunity, but for most, children entered similar occupations to their parents. Schools themselves reflected this structure. Elementary education had become more common by the turn of the century, but expectations remained modest. Children learned basic reading, writing, and arithmetic. Few continued beyond the minimum required years. School was viewed as a gateway to personal development, but as a preparation for work. The idea of childhood as a protected stage of life was still limited. Many children worked part-time or contributed to household income. Newspaper delivery, factory errands, domestic service, and farm labor were common. Childhood was not defined by innocence or leisure, but by gradual integration into adult responsibility. In the evenings, families returned to their homes and repeated familiar routines. The fire was relit, simple meals were prepared, newspapers were read aloud if available. News from London, Parliament, and the wider world entered homes in written form, mediated by editors and delayed by days or weeks. International events felt distant and abstract. The British Empire, at its height during this period, was present in daily life in subtle ways. Tea from India, sugar from the Caribbean, cotton from overseas colonies were part of ordinary consumption. Yet the empire itself was rarely visualized. It existed as a concept rather than a lived experience. For most people, it meant little more than printed maps in school books and occasional headlines in newspapers. There was no sense among ordinary people that they were living in a historically significant moment. The language of modernity and progress belonged more to politicians, intellectuals, and industrialists than to shopkeepers or factory workers. Daily life was governed by repetition, not anticipation. Technological change entered slowly and unevenly. Gas lighting had become common in towns, though many homes still relied on candles and oil lamps. Electricity existed, but was limited to certain urban areas and wealthy households. Telephones were rare. Communication remained dependent on letters and face-to-face conversation. Even major innovations were absorbed quietly. A new tram line might open. A factory might install new machinery. A shop might introduce a new product. These changes altered routines incrementally rather than dramatically. People adapted without reflection. There was no sense of being overwhelmed by the future. Clothing reflected similar patterns of continuity. Men wore dark suits, caps, and heavy coats. Women wore long skirts, blouses, and layered garments. Fashion changed slowly and was filtered through class and affordability. Most people wore the same clothes for years, repairing and reusing them until they were no longer usable. Public behavior was governed by restraint. Emotional expression was limited. Loud displays of joy, anger, or grief were considered inappropriate in public spaces. Politeness and distance structured social interaction. Even within families, emotional language was restrained. Affection was expressed through action rather than speech. Illness and death were common features of life. Medical care was limited, and many conditions were treated at home. Doctors were consulted only when necessary. Life expectancy was lower than in later decades, and families were accustomed to loss. Funerals were frequent and modest, conducted with formality and quiet acceptance. Religion remained an important social institution, though not always a deeply personal one. Church attendance was part of weekly routine for many, especially in smaller towns. Sermons emphasized duty, morality, and social order, rather than personal fulfillment. Faith was less a source of emotional comfort and more a framework for understanding obligation. Leisure existed, but it was limited and structured. Public houses offered.
For most people living in Britain at the height of the empire itself was not something they ever saw. It did not appear in the streets where they walked, the houses where they lived, or the rooms where they ate their meals. It existed instead at a distance, carried into daily life through small, indirect signs, printed words in newspapers, names of faraway places, objects imported from unseen lands, and stories that arrived without context or consequence. From the kitchen window of an ordinary British home, the empire was invisible. What could be seen were back gardens, rows of terraced houses, washing lines, coal sheds, and narrow alleys. Smoke rose from chimneys. Neighbors moved in and out of their homes. Children played near doorsteps. Nothing in this landscape suggested that Britain governed territories across Africa, Asia, and the Caribbean. Yet the empire was present, though quietly. It was present in teacups placed on kitchen tables every morning. It was present in sugar bowls, in cotton clothing, in spices that added flavor to otherwise simple meals. These items came from distant places, but their origins were rarely considered. They arrived already packaged, already familiar, already integrated into routine. Tea, perhaps more than any other product, symbolized this distant connection. It was consumed daily across all classes. It marked the beginning and end of the day. It accompanied breakfast, afternoon rest, and evening conversation. Yet few people thought about where tea came from or how it reached British ports. India and Ceylon existed as words, not realities. They were printed on tins and advertisements, but they remained abstract, imagined landscapes with no clear human presence. Sugar, similarly, was a basic ingredient rather than a political symbol. It sweetened tea, porridge, and baked goods. It was bought cheaply, measured carefully, and consumed without reflection. Its historical connection to plantations, slavery, and colonial labor had faded from everyday awareness. By the early 20th century, sugar was simply part of domestic life, stripped of its past and absorbed into habit. Cotton clothing followed the same pattern. Shirts, dresses, undergarments, curtains, and tablecloths were made from cotton imported from overseas. The fabric was soft, practical, and affordable. Its global journey, from fields to factories to shops, was invisible. What mattered was price, durability, and comfort, not geography. Newspapers were another key channel through which the empire entered domestic life. They arrived daily or weekly, folded and carried into homes. Headlines mentioned India, Egypt, South Africa, or the colonies. These places appeared as locations of events, uprisings, treaties, royal visits, or administrative changes. But the stories were brief, formal, and emotionally distant. Most readers did not engage deeply with imperial news. It was read alongside local reports about weather, accidents, and parliamentary debates. Colonial affairs felt secondary, even when they involved conflict or violence. The empire was experienced as information rather than reality, filtered through editors and stripped of detail. The language used in these reports reinforced distance. Colonial subjects were described collectively rather than individually. Places were reduced to names and statistics. Human experiences were rarely described.
The empire appeared as a system of administration, not as a network of lived lives. Letters also played a role in shaping this distant perception. Some families had relatives working overseas as soldiers, civil servants, traders, or missionaries. Letters arrived from India, Africa, or Australia, written in careful handwriting and describing unfamiliar climates, routines, and customs. These letters were often read aloud at kitchen tables. They generated mild interest and occasional pride, but they did not transform everyday life. They were absorbed into conversation and then set aside. Overseas relatives became part of family history, but their experiences remained separate from domestic reality. For most households, the empire did not bring opportunity or disruption. It did not determine employment, housing, or social status. It existed as a background presence, acknowledged but not felt. People did not identify themselves as imperial subjects. They identified themselves as workers, parents, neighbors, and citizens of towns and cities. The empire was also present in education, though in simplified form. School children learned about British colonies through maps and textbooks. They memorized names, borders, and trade routes. They colored territories in red to represent British control. These exercises presented the empire as a stable and orderly system. There was little discussion of conflict, resistance, or exploitation. Colonial populations were portrayed as passive or grateful. The empire was described as a civilizing force, spreading law, language, and technology. These narratives were absorbed without question as part of a broader moral framework that justified British authority. Yet even this educational exposure remained abstract. Children rarely connected maps to real people. Colonies existed as shapes and labels, not as human societies. The empire was something to be known, not something to be experienced. Public ceremonies reinforced this distant relationship. Royal jubilees, parades, and imperial exhibitions celebrated Britain's global reach. Flags were displayed, speeches were delivered, crowds gathered in city centers. These events created moments of visibility when the empire briefly entered public space. But these moments were temporary. Once the celebrations ended, daily routines resumed. People returned to work, shopping, and domestic responsibilities. The empire faded back into the background. Even for those directly involved in imperial administration or trade, the experience was often bureaucratic rather than adventurous. Clerks processed documents, officers followed regulations, merchants managed shipments and accounts. Their work was structured by paperwork, schedules, and institutional hierarchy. The romantic image of empire, exploration, conquest, and exotic landscapes belonged more to literature and propaganda than to ordinary experience. Most people encountered empire through mundane objects and impersonal information. This separation created a peculiar form of imperial consciousness, one that acknowledged empire without engaging with it. Britain ruled vast territories, yet most Britons lived as if their lives were entirely domestic. The empire did not reshape neighborhoods, alter family structures, or transform local economies in visible ways. Its impact was diffuse, indirect, and slow. It influenced consumption patterns, political identity, and national pride, but not daily survival. For working-class families, imperial identity had little practical value. Their concerns were wages, rent, food prices, and health. Imperial events did not affect these priorities. The empire offered no immediate solutions to economic hardship or social inequality. For middle-class families, empire provided a sense of prestige and stability. It reinforced the idea that Britain was a powerful and respected nation. This identity offered psychological reassurance rather than material benefit. In both cases, empire functioned as a distant framework rather than a lived reality. It shaped how Britain saw itself, but not how individuals experienced their own lives. Even language reflected this distance. Words like India, Africa, and the colonies were used casually, without specific meaning. They referred to large and diverse regions as single entities. This simplification made the empire easier to imagine and easier to ignore. Empire also entered domestic life through advertising. Products were marketed using colonial imagery, tea plantations, palm trees, elephants, and exotic figures. These images suggested abundance and authenticity. They created associations between empire and quality without acknowledging labor or inequality. Consumers did not interpret these images politically. They interpreted them commercially. The empire became a brand rather than a system of power. In this way, imperial presence was normalized. It became part of the visual and material environment, stripped of its historical complexity. It was not questioned because it was not experienced directly. Even major imperial events often passed quietly. Wars in distant territories received limited attention unless British casualties were high. Political crises were reported in restrained language. The emotional tone remained controlled. There was no widespread sense of urgency or moral conflict. The empire was assumed to be permanent and legitimate. Its continuation required no justification in everyday conversation. This quiet acceptance created a form of invisibility. The empire existed everywhere and nowhere at the same time. It shaped the economy, culture, and political structure of Britain, yet remained absent from personal experience. From the kitchen window, nothing suggested global dominance. There were no visible signs of foreign rule. There were only familiar routines: boiling water, washing dishes, sweep.
For most people in Britain during the late 19th and early 20th centuries, time was not measured by clocks alone. It was measured by work. The day began when work demanded it and ended when work allowed it. Hours were shaped not by personal choice, but by factory whistles, shift schedules, opening times, and the physical limits of the human body. Work did not occupy life, it organized it. In industrial towns, the morning began before sunrise. Rows of terraced houses slowly released their occupants into narrow streets. Men walked in groups toward mills, shipyards, and foundries. Women moved toward laundries, workshops, shops, or remained within the domestic sphere, where labor took a different form but followed an equally demanding rhythm. Children, when old enough, joined the same movement, walking toward schools or workplaces that blurred the line between education and employment. Factories dominated the physical landscape. Their chimneys defined skylines, their walls enclosed large numbers of workers, and their noise carried across entire neighborhoods. Inside, work followed a repetitive structure. Machines dictated pace. Human bodies adapted to mechanical rhythms. Tasks were divided into small, specific actions that required little explanation and offered little variation. The working day was long. 10 to 12 hours was common. Breaks were short and often unpaid. Meals were eaten quickly, sometimes beside machines. There was little conversation. Noise made communication difficult, and fatigue discouraged it. Workers learned to focus on movement rather than thought. In textile mills, workers stood for most of the day, monitoring spinning frames and looms. The air was thick with dust and fibers. Coughing was common. In steelworks and foundries, heat and noise dominated. Sweat soaked clothing even in winter. Accidents were frequent and rarely discussed in detail. Injuries were treated as part of the cost of employment. In mines, work took place underground, out of public view. Miners descended each morning and returned in the evening, their faces darkened with coal dust. The work was physically demanding and dangerous. Collapses, explosions, and respiratory illness were constant risks. Yet mining communities accepted these conditions as normal. There were few alternatives. Docks followed a different rhythm. Work depended on ship arrivals, weather, and global trade patterns. Dock workers gathered each morning, hoping to be selected for employment. Some were chosen. Others returned home without wages. Employment was irregular and uncertain. The physical labor was heavy, involving loading and unloading cargo by hand.
The pace shifted suddenly from inactivity to exhaustion. Offices presented a contrasting environment. Clerks, secretaries, and administrators worked indoors, seated at desks, surrounded by paper and ledgers. Their labor was mental rather than physical, but equally repetitive. They recorded transactions, filed documents, wrote letters, and followed procedures. The work required discipline, accuracy, and emotional restraint. Office work was associated with respectability and stability. It offered regular wages, predictable hours, and physical comfort. It also required conformity. Dress codes were strict. Behavior was formal. Personal expression was limited. The office demanded silence, order, and obedience. These different forms of labor created distinct social worlds. Workers rarely moved between them. A miner did not become a clerk. A factory worker did not become a dock supervisor. Occupation determined social position, and social position determined opportunity. Class was not defined by wealth alone. It was defined by accent, clothing, manners, education, and location. It shaped how people spoke to one another, how they were addressed, and what was expected of them. It was visible in everyday interactions, even when not acknowledged directly. In shops, working-class customers waited while middle-class customers were served. In public transport, class determined seating arrangements. In schools, children were grouped according to background and future prospects. Teachers adjusted expectations based on family occupation. Class also shaped personal relationships. Marriages usually occurred within the same social group. Friendships crossed class boundaries rarely and cautiously. Neighbors were often similar in status, not by choice, but by housing patterns. Terraced streets housed workers. Suburban areas housed clerks and professionals. Large houses housed the wealthy. Conversation reflected these divisions. Topics considered appropriate varied by class. Working-class conversation focused on practical concerns, wages, prices, health, and family. Middle-class conversation included literature, politics, and cultural events. These differences were not imposed by law, but by habit and expectation. Even language carried markers of class. Accents signaled origin and education. Certain words and phrases were associated with respectability. Others were considered vulgar or uneducated. People adjusted their speech depending on context, often unconsciously. The workplace reinforced these patterns. Supervisors and managers spoke differently from laborers. Instructions were given, not discussed. Decisions flowed downward. Authority was visible in posture, tone, and distance. Workers learned to recognize hierarchy without needing explanation. Wages determined living conditions. Working-class families spent most of their income on rent, food, and fuel. Savings were minimal. Illness or unemployment created immediate hardship. There was little security. Life was managed from week to week. Middle-class families had more stability. They could afford larger homes, better education, and occasional leisure. They employed domestic servants who occupied a separate social position within the same household. Servants lived in their employers' homes, followed strict schedules, and performed repetitive tasks: cleaning, cooking, washing, and childcare. Their work was constant and invisible. Their presence was expected, but their individuality was not. Servants occupied an ambiguous position. They were neither family nor independent workers. They were subject to both personal and professional authority. Their behavior was regulated by rules, and their social lives were limited. Yet for many, service offered stability and shelter compared to factory or farm work. Work also shaped leisure. Time left was limited and structured. Sundays were reserved for rest and religious observance. Even leisure activities reflected class. Working-class leisure involved public houses, local sports, and informal gatherings. Middle-class leisure involved clubs, theaters, reading, and organized events. The concept of free time existed, but it was narrow. Fatigue limited activity. Most leisure consisted of rest rather than recreation. Entertainment was simple and local. There was little emphasis on self-improvement or personal fulfillment. Gender roles further structured daily life. Men were expected to earn wages. Women were expected to manage households. Even when women worked outside the home, their labor was often considered temporary or secondary. Marriage usually ended formal employment for women, especially in middle-class families. These expectations were not questioned openly. They were reinforced by law, custom, religion, and education. Deviations were possible, but they attracted attention and criticism. Social stability depended on conformity. Workplaces also functioned as communities. People worked with the same colleagues for years. Relationships formed through shared routines rather than shared interests. Loyalty developed through familiarity and dependence. Conflict existed, but it was often managed quietly. Trade unions emerged as a response to working conditions, but their presence varied by industry and region. Some workers joined, others avoided involvement. Union activity introduced new forms of collective identity, but it did not eliminate class divisions. It operated within them. Strikes occurred, but they were disruptive and risky. They threatened income and stability. Many workers preferred endurance to confrontation. The culture of work valued reliability, obedience, and patience. This culture shaped emotional life. Pride was associated with endurance rather than achievement. Success meant stability, not advancement. People valued the ability to maintain routine under difficult conditions. The language of ambition existed, but it was restrained. Few people expected dramatic changes in their circumstances. Life was understood as a sequence of predictable stages: childhood, work, marriage, parenthood, and decline. Work filled most of these stages. Retirement was rare. Many worked until illness or physical weakness prevented it. Old age was not a separate phase of life, but a gradual withdrawal from labor. Family support replaced wages. Work also shaped identity. People introduced themselves by occupation. It defined social reputation. Being a good worker meant being punctual, reliable, and compliant. Skill mattered, but discipline mattered more. This identity extended beyond the workplace. It influenced clothing, posture, and behavior. People carried their occupational roles into public space. A clerk walked differently from a laborer. A supervisor spoke differently from a cleaner. Class was not simply a...
Modern life did not arrive in Britain with a single invention or a sudden transformation. It came quietly, in fragments, spread across decades, entering daily routines so gradually that most people hardly noticed when the old world ended and the new one began. There was no clear moment when life became modern. There were only small adjustments, repeated often enough to become normal. In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, streets were still lit primarily by gas lamps. These lamps stood on iron posts, spaced evenly along roads and in town squares. Each evening, a lamplighter walked from one to the next, carrying a long pole with a flame at its end. He opened the glass case, lit the gas, and moved on. The process was slow and methodical. It followed the same route every night. The glow of gaslight was soft and uneven. It created long shadows and left much of the street in partial darkness. People adjusted their movements accordingly. Shops closed early. Walking after sunset required caution. The night was not designed for activity, but for rest. When electric light began to appear, it did not replace gas immediately. It arrived first in public buildings, railway stations, theaters, and wealthy homes. For most people, electricity was something they saw occasionally, not something they used daily. It appeared brighter, whiter, and more reliable, but also unfamiliar and slightly unnatural. Electric light did not change behavior overnight. People still went to bed early. Shops still closed at similar hours. The rhythm of the day remained tied to natural light and established habits. Electricity extended visibility, but it did not immediately extend activity. In working-class homes, candles and oil lamps remained common well into the 20th century. They were cheaper and easier to maintain. Electricity required wiring, installation, and monthly payments. It was seen as a convenience rather than a necessity. Even when electric lighting became available, some families used it sparingly. One bulb in the main room was enough. Other rooms remained dark or candlelit. Modernity entered the home partially, not completely. The same pattern applied to transport. Trams appeared in cities and large towns, running on tracks laid through busy streets. They offered a new form of mobility, faster than walking, cheaper than carriages, and more predictable than horse-drawn vehicles. At first, trams were viewed with curiosity. They were noisy and unfamiliar. People watched them pass, unsure how to use them. Conductors collected fares. Passengers stood or sat quietly, adjusting to shared public transport. Trams did not revolutionize daily life immediately. Most people still lived close to their workplaces. Travel distances remained short. The tram extended options, but did not create new ambitions. It made movement easier, not different. Over time, trams reshaped urban geography. People could live slightly further from work. Suburbs expanded. Commuting became more common. Yet this process unfolded slowly across generations. No one experienced it as a sudden shift. The telephone followed a similar path. Early telephones were rare, expensive, and limited to businesses, government offices, and wealthy households. They were large, fixed devices, often placed in hallways or offices. Using them required learning new forms of communication. People did not trust telephones at first. Voices arrived without bodies. Messages traveled without letters. The technology felt impersonal and unreliable. Many preferred face-to-face conversation or written correspondence. Even when telephones became more common, their use remained limited. They were used for practical matters, arranging deliveries, contacting employers, reporting emergencies. They were not used for casual conversation. Social life remained rooted in physical presence. For working-class families, the telephone was often entirely absent. Messages were delivered by hand, through neighbors, shops, or family members. Communication remained slow and local. The idea of instant contact did not reshape emotional expectations. People were accustomed to waiting. Letters took days or weeks. Responses were delayed. Silence was normal. The telephone did not create urgency. It simply offered another option. Electric appliances entered homes gradually as well. Early devices included electric irons, kettles, and heaters. They promised convenience, but required trust in unfamiliar systems. Many families continued using coal stoves and manual tools. Electricity did not remove labor from domestic life. Washing, cleaning, and cooking remained physically demanding. Machines assisted certain tasks, but did not eliminate effort. The household routine remained largely unchanged. Modern technology was often unreliable. Power cuts were common. Machines broke. Repairs were slow. People maintained older methods as backup. The new did not replace the old. It existed alongside it. This coexistence created a layered experience of time. Old and new technologies shared the same space. Gas lamps stood beside electric lights. Horses shared roads with trams. Letters existed alongside telephones. Life became a mixture of centuries. There was no collective sense of living in a modern age. The language of modernity belonged to advertisers, engineers, and politicians. Ordinary people described changes in practical terms. It's brighter, it's quicker, it's easier. They did not describe them as revolutionary. New technologies were judged by usefulness, not symbolism. If something saved time or effort, it was adopted. If it was expensive or unreliable, it was ignored. Progress was selective, not universal. Public reactions were cautious rather than enthusiastic. People did not expect technology to improve their lives dramatically. They expected it to function. When it did, it became part of routine. When it did not, it was abandoned. Even major innovations failed to create emotional impact. The first electric streetlights did not produce celebrations. The first tram lines did not inspire speeches. The first telephones did not alter social identity. Modern life did not feel new. It felt adjusted. The pace of change was slow enough to allow adaptation without disruption. Children grew up with technologies their parents had learned gradually. There was no generational shock. Each generation inherited a slightly altered world. This slow arrival shaped perception. People did not feel overwhelmed by the future. They felt surrounded by familiar objects with minor differences. The world remained recognizable. The absence of drama also meant the absence of fear. New technologies were not seen as threats. They were seen as tools. They entered life quietly and stayed. Even the motor car followed this pattern. Early cars were rare and unreliable. They shared roads with horses and pedestrians. They were noisy and required frequent repairs. For many years, they remained a curiosity rather than a necessity. Most people continued walking, using trams or traveling by train. Cars belonged to the wealthy. They did not alter urban design or social structure until much later. Radio, which would later transform communication, had not yet entered most homes. Silence remained the dominant feature of daily life. Information traveled slowly. News arrived through newspapers, word of mouth, and public notices. Modern life, in this sense, was not about speed. It was about incremental convenience. Even architecture reflected this continuity. New buildings were constructed using traditional designs. Streets looked similar. Houses retained familiar layouts. There was no sudden change in how people inhabited space. Factories adopted new machines, but working conditions remained harsh. Offices used typewriters, but clerical labor remained repetitive. Technology improved efficiency without improving experience. The promise of modernity was rarely fulfilled in emotional terms. It did not produce happiness or freedom. It produced minor adjustments to routine. People did not describe themselves as modern. They described themselves as tired, busy, and practical. Life was still dominated by work, family, and social obligation. The idea that technology would transform society existed in theory, not in experience. For most people, modern life felt like old life with slightly better tools. This gradual process shaped cultural memory. Later generations would look back and identify this period as the beginning of modern Britain, but those living through it did not perceive a beginning. They perceived continuity. They did not witness the arrival of a new world. They witnessed the modification of an old one. Gas lamps were replaced one by one. Trams extended street by street. Telephones appeared office by office. Electricity entered home by home. No single change marked a transition. The modern world did not arrive, it accumulated. And because it arrived so slowly, it never demanded attention. It never interrupted routine. It never required explanation. The First World War did not arrive in most British homes as a story of heroism or excitement. It arrived as an interruption. It entered daily life not through explosions or marching soldiers, but through changes in routine, paperwork, queues, and absences. For families who remained at home, the war was not experienced as action, but as waiting. In the summer of 1914, many people first learned of the war through newspapers and public notices. Headlines spoke of alliances, mobilizations, and declarations. The language was formal and distant. It described events in Europe, diplomatic decisions, and military preparations. Few understood what these words would mean in practical terms. Life did not change immediately. Shops remained open, trains continued to run, people went to work as usual. The war existed as information, not as experience. it was something happening elsewhere. Men were called to enlist through posters, speeches, and recruitment offices. Some volunteered quickly, influenced by social pressure, patriotism, or curiosity. Others delayed, uncertain about what was expected of them. There was no clear image of what the war involved. Most had never left Britain, let alone imagined modern industrial warfare. For families, enlistment meant separation. Fathers, sons, brothers, and husbands left homes carrying small bags and official papers. There were no dramatic farewells. Most departures were quiet. People stood on railway platforms, exchanged brief words, and returned home. Once the men had gone, daily life became centered on absence. Chairs remained empty, beds remained unused, routines adjusted around missing people. Women took on additional responsibilities. Children learned to behave more quietly. The war entered the home through letters. These arrived irregularly, sometimes weeks apart. They were written in careful language, censored by authorities, and self-censored by writers. Soldiers described weather, food, and general conditions. They avoided describing danger or fear. Families read these letters repeatedly. They looked for details, hidden meanings, and reassurance. Silence between letters created anxiety. When days passed without news, imagination filled the gap. Waiting became the central experience of the war. Waiting for letters, waiting for news, waiting for the end. Rationing introduced new routines. At first, food shortages were mild, but gradually they became systematic. Ration books were issued. Items such as sugar, meat, butter, and bread were limited. People learned to measure consumption carefully. Shopping became more complex. Queues formed outside shops. People waited for deliveries. Supplies were unpredictable. Recipes changed. Meals became simpler. Food was no longer a matter of preference, but of availability. Rationing did not produce dramatic hunger for most families, but it introduced constant adjustment. It required planning, restraint, and patience. Food became a logistical problem rather than a social pleasure. Coal shortages affected heating. Homes were colder. People wore extra clothing indoors. Baths were less frequent. Washing was delayed. Comfort became secondary to necessity. Public transport continued, but was less reliable. Trains were used for military purposes. Delays became common. Travel required more planning and more waiting. Hospitals and clinics were busier. Injured soldiers were brought back to Britain. Some returned to families with visible wounds. Others returned changed in ways that were not visible. These returns were often awkward. Men struggled to reintegrate into domestic routines. Families did not know how to ask questions. Conversations remained cautious. The war was not discussed openly. Official notices were displayed in public spaces. Lists of casualties appeared in newspapers. People scanned these lists carefully, looking for familiar names. When a name appeared, the information was minimal: rank, regiment, date. There were no details, no descriptions, only confirmation. Death entered homes through telegrams and letters written in formal language. "We regret to inform you" became a familiar phrase. These messages were delivered by officials, often in person. Grief was expressed quietly. Funerals were modest. Bodies were often not returned. Families mourned without physical presence. There were no graves to visit. Loss became abstract. The absence of closure shaped emotional life. People did not know how or where their loved ones had died. They imagined scenarios, often more gentle than reality. The lack of information allowed uncertainty to persist. The war also introduced new forms of bureaucracy. Identity papers, permits, and registration became common. Citizens were required to prove age, occupation, and residency. The state entered daily life through documentation. Women entered new forms of work. They replaced men in factories, offices, and transport services. This shift was not celebrated. It was presented as temporary necessity. Women worked long hours under difficult conditions. They learned new skills quickly. Their labor was essential, but rarely acknowledged. When men returned, women were expected to leave these roles. Children experienced the war as a disruption of stability. Schools were affected by teacher shortages. Lessons were interrupted. Play was restricted by air raid warnings and parental anxiety. The sound of war entered Britain through sirens and drills. Air raids were limited during the First World War, but the fear of attack existed. People were instructed how to respond. Blackouts were introduced in some areas. These preparations created a constant sense of anticipation. Even when nothing happened, people remained alert. The war was always expected, never fully present. Public spaces changed. Posters encouraged savings, recruitment, and sacrifice. Flags were displayed. Speeches were delivered. Yet these symbols did not transform everyday emotion. They existed alongside fatigue and uncertainty. The language of heroism did not match lived experience. Newspapers described battles, victories, and national pride. At home, people experienced waiting, paperwork, and quiet loss. Time became distorted. Days felt long. Weeks passed slowly. The future was unclear. There was no timeline for the war's end. People could not plan beyond immediate needs. The war also created a culture of restraint. Emotional expression was discouraged. Complaining was seen as unpatriotic. Fear was hidden. Grief was contained. Silence became a common response. People avoided discussing the war directly. They focused on practical matters: food, work, health, and weather. The war existed in the background. This silence shaped memory. Later generations would remember battles and generals. Those who lived through the war remembered queues, letters, and empty chairs. The war was not experienced as a single event, but as a prolonged condition. It did not dominate every moment, but it altered every routine. Even celebrations were subdued. Holidays continued, but with limited resources. Christmas was marked by shortages and absence. Birthdays were acknowledged through letters and small gifts. Leisure became minimal. Entertainment was restricted. Theaters and cinemas operated, but attendance declined. People were tired, anxious, and distracted. Religion offered some comfort. Churches were busier. Prayers focused on protection and return. Sermons emphasized endurance and duty. The idea of victory existed, but it was abstract. People did not imagine how victory would feel. They imagined return, the return of men, of normal routines, of familiar rhythms. When the war finally ended in 1918, the transition was not dramatic for most families. There were public celebrations, but domestic life remained cautious. Men returned slowly. Some did not return at all. Others returned injured, ill, or emotionally changed. Families adjusted again. The war did not conclude. It faded. Rationing continued. Economic difficulties followed. Grief remained unresolved. The war became part of personal history, not as a story, but as a period of absence. For those who experienced it at home, the First World War was not defined by movement or action. It was defined by stillness. It was lived in kitchens, waiting rooms, shops, and bedrooms. It was marked by paperwork, silence, and repetition. It did not. The years between the two world wars did not feel like a clear period of peace in Britain. They felt like a pause that never fully settled into stability. The war had ended, but its effects remained present in daily life, in the economy, in families, in public attitudes, and in the quiet uncertainty that shaped how people imagined the future. The interwar years were not defined by dramatic recovery or bold optimism, but by modest hopes, economic anxiety, and a slow, careful attempt to continue. When the First World War ended in 1918, there was a brief moment of visible celebration. Crowds gathered in city centers, flags were raised, bells rang. Newspapers announced victory and the promise of a new era. But these moments passed quickly. Within weeks, everyday concerns returned to the foreground. Demobilized soldiers came home in large numbers. Some returned to familiar jobs. Others found that their positions had disappeared. Industries that had expanded during the war now contracted. Factories reduced production. Offices cut staff. The labor market became unstable. For many families, the return of men did not restore old routines. Some men returned injured, unable to work. Others returned emotionally changed, quieter and more withdrawn. The war had altered their sense of purpose, but there were few social structures to support adjustment. Families were expected to absorb these changes privately. Economic uncertainty became a constant presence. The post-war economy struggled to adapt. Britain faced rising unemployment, especially in traditional industries such as coal mining, shipbuilding, and textiles. Entire regions experienced long-term decline. In industrial towns, unemployment became a normal condition rather than a temporary problem. Men gathered outside labor exchanges each morning, hoping for work that rarely appeared. Some were called in for a few days, others waited for months or years. The rhythm of daily life changed. Instead of leaving for work, many men remained at home or wandered through town. Time lost its structure. Days were no longer divided by shifts and schedules. They were filled with waiting. For families dependent on a single income, unemployment created immediate hardship. Savings disappeared quickly. Government assistance was limited and often conditional. People were required to prove their need through paperwork and inspections. The process of applying for benefits was slow and impersonal. Forms were filled out, interviews were conducted, officials assessed household conditions. Privacy was reduced. Poverty became a bureaucratic category. Women played a central role in managing scarcity. They stretched food budgets, reused clothing, and found ways to maintain household stability with limited resources. Meals became simpler, portions were smaller, waste was avoided. The domestic routine remained demanding, but the emotional tone shifted. There was less confidence and more caution. Purchases were delayed. Repairs were preferred over replacements. Consumption became restrained. Children experienced the interwar period as a mixture of continuity and uncertainty. Schools remained open, but expectations were limited. Education promised little improvement in employment prospects. Many left school early to contribute to household income. Youth unemployment became a widespread concern. Young men and women entered adulthood without stable work. Their transition into independence was delayed. Many remained living with parents longer than expected. The idea of progress felt uncertain. The war had been described as a conflict that would create a better world, but the reality of the 1920s and 1930s did not match these expectations. Instead of opportunity, people encountered stagnation. Public discourse reflected this tension. Newspapers discussed economic recovery, industrial reform, and international peace, but these topics felt abstract compared to local experience. The language of policy did not address everyday anxiety. International events entered awareness through news reports, the Treaty of Versailles, political instability in Europe, financial crises. But for most people, these were distant developments. Their main concern remained employment and security. The general strike of 1926 briefly disrupted daily life across Britain. Transport stopped, newspapers ceased publication, services were interrupted. For a short period, the normal functioning of society paused. Yet even this major event was experienced quietly by many families. It meant fewer trains, empty streets, and uncertainty about supplies. But it did not produce mass political mobilization. Most people waited for it to end. The strike reinforced a sense of fragility. It suggested that social order could be disrupted, but also that individuals had little influence over outcomes. Decisions were made elsewhere, by institutions beyond daily life. Housing conditions improved slowly during the interwar years. New council estates were built, especially in suburban areas. These offered better sanitation, more space, and access to gardens. For families who moved into these homes, the change was significant. They experienced improved comfort and privacy. Yet these improvements were unevenly distributed. Many remained in older, overcrowded housing. The move to suburban estates also altered social life. Neighborhoods became less dense. Social interaction became more limited. People knew fewer neighbors. Community ties weakened gradually. Leisure became more visible during this period, though still constrained by income. Cinemas expanded across towns and cities. Films offered affordable entertainment and temporary escape from daily concerns. The cinema created shared cultural experience. People watched newsreels, dramas, and comedies. These images offered alternate worlds, glamorous, adventurous, and emotionally expressive. Yet cinema did not transform daily life. It provided distraction, not solution. After the film ended, people returned to the same routines and limitations. Radio entered homes gradually during the interwar years. It introduced new forms of communication. Voices from London reached remote towns. Music, speeches, and news were broadcast nationally. Radio created a sense of connection. People listened together in living rooms. They followed events in real time. The pace of information increased. Yet even radio reinforced restraint. Broadcast language was formal and controlled. Emotion was limited. The tone remained calm and authoritative. Political life during the interwar period was marked by cautious reform. The extension of voting rights, the growth of the Labor Party, and debates over welfare created new possibilities. But these developments did not produce immediate transformation. Working-class living conditions improved slowly. Inequality remained visible. The social structure persisted. The idea of the future remained uncertain. There was no clear narrative of progress. People did not expect dramatic improvement. They hoped for stability. Hope during this period was modest. It focused on practical goals: steady work, affordable food, manageable health, and the absence of another war. Memory of the First World War remained present. Memorials were erected in towns and villages. Names of the dead were engraved in stone. Annual ceremonies reinforced collective remembrance. These memorials created a quiet awareness of loss. They reminded people of past disruption. They reinforced a desire for peace, even at the cost of compromise. International tensions grew during the 1930s. The rise of new political regimes in Europe appeared in news reports. Words like rearmament and appeasement entered public language. Yet these developments were experienced indirectly. People read about them in newspapers or heard about them on radio. They did not feel immediate threat. There was no widespread preparation for another war. Memories of the previous one discouraged anticipation. People preferred not to imagine repetition. Economic anxiety remained the dominant emotional condition. The Great Depression affected Britain unevenly, but it reinforced insecurity. Jobs disappeared, wages fell, businesses closed. In many communities, unemployment became generational. Fathers, sons, and neighbors shared the same condition. Work was no longer a guaranteed stage of life. This situation reshaped identity. Being unemployed became normal rather than exceptional. People learned to structure days without formal labor. Time became passive. Yet endurance remained a core value. Families
The Second World War entered British life not as a sudden collapse of normality, but as a gradual tightening of routine. It did not immediately replace daily habits, it reorganized them. The war was experienced not primarily through battles or military strategy, but through procedures, air raid warnings, evacuation notices, ration books, timetables, and cues. Ordinary life continued, but under new rules. When war was declared in September 1939, there were no mass celebrations or dramatic scenes in most towns. People listened to the announcement on the radio, finished their meals, and went to bed. The next morning, shops opened as usual, trains ran, work continued. The war existed as an instruction rather than an event. Preparation had already begun before fighting reached Britain. Gas masks were distributed to civilians, blackout curtains were installed in homes, streetlights were dimmed or switched off entirely. People were taught how to behave in emergencies through pamphlets and public demonstrations. These measures did not produce fear so much as discipline. People learned procedures and followed them. The war was understood as a series of tasks to be completed correctly. The blackout transformed the appearance of towns and cities. At night, streets disappeared into darkness. Windows were covered. Cars drove with dimmed headlights. People walked cautiously, guided by memory rather than visibility. This darkness altered social life. Evening activities declined. People stayed at home. Entertainment became limited to radio, conversation, and reading. Silence became more noticeable. The first air raids confirmed that the war would reach civilian life directly. Sirens sounded without warning. People stopped what they were doing and moved to shelters. Some used public shelters. Others remained in their homes, sitting under stairs or in reinforced rooms. Air raids were not constant at first. They came in waves, separated by long periods of waiting. This waiting became central to the wartime experience. People lived with the expectation of interruption. When sirens sounded, people did not panic. They followed rehearsed procedures. They gathered essential items, checked neighbors, and waited. The routine became familiar. Shelters were crowded and uncomfortable. People sat on wooden benches or on the ground. Conversations were minimal. Children slept. Adults listened to distant explosions without comment. When raids ended, people returned home and resumed activities. There was little discussion of what had happened. Damage was repaired if possible. Broken windows were covered. Life continued. The emotional tone of these experiences was restrained. Fear existed, but it was not expressed openly. Complaining was discouraged. Endurance was valued. Evacuation was one of the most disruptive changes to daily life. Children were sent from cities to rural areas. They traveled in groups, carrying small bags and labels with their names. For many children, this was their first experience of leaving home. They were placed with unfamiliar families. Living conditions varied widely. Some were welcomed, others were tolerated. Evacuation was not presented as a trauma. It was described as a necessary procedure. Children were expected to adapt quickly.
Parents adjusted to absence. Homes became quieter. Daily routines changed. Mothers managed households without children. Fathers continued working or serving in the military. Communication between families was maintained through letters. These were brief and practical. Emotional language was limited. Everyone assumed the separation was temporary. Evacuation did not produce dramatic emotional breakdown. It produced quiet reorganization. Families learned to function with altered structures. Rationing was reintroduced and expanded. Food, clothing, fuel, and household goods were controlled. Each person received a ration book. Items were purchased through points and coupons. Shopping became a logistical activity. People planned meals based on availability rather than preference. Queues formed outside shops. People waited without complaint. Queues became a social space. People stood together in silence or exchanged small talk. They compared information about deliveries. They adjusted expectations. Meals were simple and repetitive. New recipes were introduced by government campaigns. People learned to cook with limited ingredients. Waste was avoided. Leftovers were reused. Clothes were repaired. Consumption became careful and deliberate. Rationing did not cause widespread hunger, but it required constant management. Domestic life became more organized and more restricted. Work routines also changed. Many industries shifted to war production. Factories operated longer hours. Women entered roles previously held by men. This shift was not celebrated. It was described as duty. Women worked in factories, offices, farms, and transport services. Their labor was essential, but temporary. Workplaces adopted strict schedules. Shifts were regulated. Output was monitored. Efficiency became a moral value. Even leisure was organized. Entertainment continued, but under restrictions. Cinemas and theaters remained open, but blackouts and air raids disrupted schedules. Radio became the central source of information. People listened to news bulletins, speeches, and music. The radio created a shared national experience. Broadcast language was controlled and calm. Information was filtered. Panic was avoided. The tone remained steady. Public information campaigns taught people how to behave. Posters explained how to save fuel, prevent accidents, and support morale. The language of these campaigns emphasized procedure rather than emotion. People were instructed, not inspired. The war introduced a culture of compliance. People accepted rules without debate. They trusted institutions. They followed instructions. This discipline created stability. It allowed society to function under pressure. It also limited emotional expression. People did not describe their feelings openly. They focused on tasks. Emotional life became internal. Loss was experienced privately. Many families received news of deaths through official channels. Grief was contained. Funerals were modest. Memorials were postponed. Mourning was managed quietly. The war did not produce visible chaos. It produced controlled disruption. Even bombing raids were followed by administrative processes. Damage was assessed. Forms were filled out. Repairs were scheduled. People learned to live with uncertainty through routine. They expected interruption. They adjusted plans. Children grew up with sirens, blackouts, and ration books as normal features of life. They adapted easily. Education continued, though disrupted. Schools relocated. Lessons were shortened. Teachers adjusted schedules. Health services operated under pressure. Hospitals treated casualties and civilians. Resources were limited. Yet life continued. Birthdays were celebrated with small gifts. Holidays were marked quietly. Religious services continued. The war became part of everyday structure. It did not dominate consciousness. It framed it.
People did not think of themselves as living through history. They thought of themselves as managing circumstances. The emotional restraint of wartime Britain was not accidental, it was cultural. It reflected long-standing values of endurance, privacy, and control. Fear was managed through procedure. Anxiety was contained through routine. Even when the war intensified, daily life remained organized. People woke up, went to work, queued for food, listened to the radio, and went to bed. The war did not remove routine, it replaced one routine with another. Victory, when it finally arrived, was celebrated publicly, but even then, the transition was careful. Rationing continued, work routines remained, reconstruction began slowly. The war did not end abruptly, it faded into post-war life. For ordinary Britons, the Second World War was not an adventure, it was a prolonged condition of disciplined living. It was experienced through schedules, instructions, and restraint. People did not remember battles, they remembered cues. They did not remember speeches, they remembered ration books. They did not remember fear, they remembered waiting. The war shaped behavior more than belief. It taught people how to endure disruption without visible collapse. It reinforced habits of compliance, patience, and emotional control. The discipline of routine allowed society to function under extraordinary.
The end of the British Empire did not arrive with fireworks, speeches, or grand ceremonies in most homes across the United Kingdom. It arrived quietly, through administrative processes, changed maps, and distant announcements on the radio. For ordinary people, decolonization was not an event of drama. It was a series of small, largely impersonal adjustments to a world that had always seemed larger than it actually was. In the years following the Second World War, Britain faced the reality that its global holdings were no longer sustainable. The war had weakened the nation materially and psychologically. Resources were depleted. The treasury was strained. Colonial administration required personnel, infrastructure, and finances that the exhausted government could no longer reliably provide. Yet these pressures were conveyed to the public not as crises, but as statements of policy, often couched in formal, measured language. Announcements of independence came in newspapers and on the radio. The transition of India and Pakistan in 1947, for example, was described in carefully written bulletins. Listeners learned that boundaries had been drawn, governments established, and power transferred. Most British listeners did not travel to witness these changes, nor did they have direct contact with the people most affected. The events were distant, almost abstract. People in the United Kingdom adjusted their understanding slowly. Maps on classroom walls changed over years rather than overnight. Atlas publishers updated editions to reflect new countries and borders. Geography lessons shifted subtly. Students learned that a familiar name no longer referred to a British territory, but to an independent state with its own governance. Parents and children noticed these changes passively, often without conversation. Decolonization was handled administratively. Governors received letters, departments prepared forms, and legal documents were rewritten. Territories were transferred from one authority to another with formal notices, civil servants completing checklists and reports. This process mirrored bureaucratic life at home, precise, orderly, and devoid of spectacle. For ordinary Britons, this sense of empire had already been more symbolic than practical for decades. Trade, culture, and military presence had connected the United Kingdom to distant lands, but daily life rarely required direct engagement with colonial subjects. People drank tea, read newspapers, and watched films that depicted foreign places, but these encounters were mediated through commerce and media. The disappearance of imperial control altered these connections only subtly at first. Colonial administrators returned home or were reassigned, but few ordinary citizens noticed.
The absence of a governor from Nairobi or Rangoon did not disrupt daily routines in Liverpool, Manchester, or London. Families continued their work, children attended school, and local businesses operated as usual. The empire had existed in their minds and on the radio. Its end did not intrude into kitchens, offices, or streets. Rationing, still present after the Second World War, continued to occupy domestic attention far more than the transfer of sovereignty across continents. Food, fuel, and housing demanded planning and patience. Households were preoccupied with daily survival and modest comfort. Announcements of independence arrived as background information, something acknowledged during breakfast or in passing on the evening news. Even news coverage reflected distance. Correspondents reported on elections, boundary agreements, and ceremonies, but rarely described the personal lives of the people most affected. Photographs appeared in newspapers, but they were formal, showing officials in crowds rather than intimate experience. Ordinary citizens encountered these stories abstractly. India had a prime minister, Ghana had a constitution, Malaya would soon elect leaders. These details mattered more to bureaucrats and historians than to families on suburban streets. Trade patterns shifted gradually. Companies adjusted contracts and tariffs. Imports and exports realigned. Tea, sugar, rubber, and textiles arrived with slightly altered labels, sometimes from different sources. Housewives noticed these changes quietly. An Indian tea bag now bore a new country name. Sugar came from a different port. Consumption continued, uninterrupted by politics. The language of administration dominated perception. Declarations emphasized governance, law, and procedure. Effective immediately, the Dominion assumes full responsibility, or Her Majesty's government has transferred authority in accordance with legislation. There were no references to emotion or ceremony for the general public. Even in celebrations that did occur in former colonies, news reports were factual rather than romanticized. For returning colonial officers, the changes were more concrete. They packed personal belongings, closed offices, and adjusted to civilian life in Britain. Some faced housing shortages or employment difficulties. Their experience contrasted sharply with the smooth continuity perceived at home, revealing that the end of empire meant very different things depending on proximity. Public opinion in Britain was muted. Debates in Parliament occurred, but the average citizen responded with limited engagement. Some welcomed independence movements as moral progress or practical necessity. Others expressed nostalgia for a world that had always felt more symbolic than tangible. Newspapers carried letters from readers expressing curiosity, concern, or indifference. The Commonwealth emerged as a way to preserve connection without formal control. This adaptation reinforced the quiet continuity of daily life. People could still send letters to relatives abroad, purchase goods from familiar colonies, and listen to radio broadcasts from the former territories. The empire had ended administratively, but cultural and economic ties lingered. Education reflected these shifts gradually. Schools updated lessons on world history and geography. Children learned about new states and leaders. Maps were reprinted with renamed countries and adjusted borders. Teachers explained that colonial rule had ceased, but the day-to-day curriculum remained unchanged. Modern history was presented as a series of administrative milestones rather than dramatic revolutions. Cinema and literature portrayed empire nostalgically or critically, depending on context, but these portrayals were entertainment rather than lived experience. Families watched films, read novels, and attended lectures about faraway lands, but the loss of formal control did not create personal upheaval. Awareness of decolonization was mediated by media, not by participation. Government documents reflected the procedural nature of independence. Legal transitions were meticulously recorded. Citizenship, taxation, and property rights were clarified through forms and correspondence. Those responsible for implementation followed checklists, ensuring compliance. For the public, these processes were invisible unless they had personal connections or professional interest. Economic shifts accompanying decolonization were gradual. Trade contracts changed, shipping routes adjusted, and businesses adapted to new political realities. For consumers, the impact was minimal at first. Imported goods still appeared on market shelves, often sourced from the same regions with different names on the labels. Prices fluctuated with global markets rather than political announcements. The end of empire also altered diplomatic relationships. Embassies, high commissions, and international treaties took on new significance. British officials corresponded with new governments, attending to formalities and protocol. These interactions were distant for the public, mediated by newspapers and broadcasts. Ordinary citizens rarely considered their existence beyond abstract curiosity. Decolonization reshaped identity slowly. Citizens who had grown up with the idea of global British authority found their perception of the world adjusted over years. Imperial nostalgia persisted among older generations, but younger people increasingly understood Britain as a smaller, more regional power. This shift occurred through quiet observation and accumulated knowledge, rather than dramatic events. The media played a key role in framing perception. Newspapers reported changes in capitals, announced independence dates, and described constitutional arrangements. Radio broadcasters relayed these facts with formal tone. There was little editorializing in early coverage. News emphasized procedure, not emotion. Listeners absorbed this information as they would any distant administrative announcement. For most households, empire had always been more abstract than concrete. The disappearance of direct control did not alter daily routines. Families continued their work, meals, and leisure activities without noticeable disruption. The maps on walls changed slowly. Tea, sugar, and other goods still arrived on shelves. Empire had ended, but domestic life had endured, quietly, without ceremony. Occasionally, public celebrations occurred in former colonies. Ceremonial flags were raised, speeches delivered, and documents signed. In Britain, these events were described in factual reports. Families listened on the radio, noted the dates, and returned to their routines. There was no national procession or collective mourning or celebration.
After the devastation of the Second World War, Britain emerged into a world that felt at once familiar and profoundly different. Streets were still lined with the same terraced houses that had survived bombing, though some had gaps where homes had been lost, and others carried the subtle scars of shattered windows or patched roofs. For most families, life continued in rhythms that were unchanged for decades. Work, meals, church on Sunday, and the small pleasures of leisure. Yet gradually, the country began to settle into something new, something measured and deliberate, the welfare state. It arrived not with fireworks or speeches, but quietly, bureaucratically, and with a promise of security that touched every household in some way. At first, the welfare state seemed like a set of unfamiliar rules. It existed in offices, in dusty government buildings, in piles of paperwork that most people encountered only indirectly. Families were told they were entitled to pensions, health care, and housing support, but these were abstract words. What mattered most to daily life were the small, practical effects. No longer did the fear of illness or old age weigh as heavily. A broken leg, once a potential financial catastrophe, could now be treated in hospital without immediate worry about payment. The thought that your children could see a doctor without rationed care became a quiet relief, almost imperceptible in its impact at first, but transformative over time. The NHS, founded in 1948, became the most visible and immediate part of this new normal. Hospitals had always existed, of course, but they had been places where cost and class dictated care. To enter an NHS hospital was to step into a space where service was guided not by ability to pay, but by need. At first, people approached this strange idea cautiously. Some believed that free medical treatment might come with hidden costs,
or that the quality would be inferior. Yet, slowly, the system proved itself. Nurses in crisp white uniforms, doctors with steady hands, and orderly wards became familiar sights. Routine checkups, vaccinations for children, and maternity care created a quiet reassurance that had never existed before. Illness became a manageable interruption rather than a looming disaster. Council housing followed its own steady path, shaping communities in ways that would last for generations. Across towns and cities, new estates were built, sometimes replacing homes destroyed in the Blitz, sometimes replacing the most dilapidated tenements. These houses were modest, sometimes painfully uniform, but they provided security. Families moved in with the knowledge that rent was controlled, that eviction would be difficult, and that their children would have a stable roof over their heads. For many, this was an unfamiliar sensation. Stability. Generations who had experienced precarious work and housing felt a gentle shift in their expectations. Ambition, once entwined with survival, began to be replaced, for some, with quiet contentment. Life no longer demanded constant striving just to keep a family clothed and fed. Instead, it allowed small pleasures, tending a garden, reading by a window, sharing meals without immediate anxiety about the next rent payment. The introduction of pensions added another layer to this new normal. Elderly people who had spent decades working hard now had a guarantee of income. For the first time in many lives, old age was something to live through, not something to fear. Grandparents became less dependent on their children's meager earnings, and the dynamic within families shifted subtly. Conversations about money became calmer. Planning for the week was no longer dominated by the next urgent bill or emergency. Instead, people began to think about visits, about celebrations, about small improvements in daily life. Yet security came at a cost, or at least a change. Ambition, which had driven families to take risks, to move cities, or to start small businesses, sometimes lost its urgency. The slow accumulation of guarantees encouraged caution. People began to measure success not only in wealth, but in continuity. A roof over the head, food on the table, children in school, the ability to walk without fear of sickness. Dreams persisted, of course, but they were often reshaped by a quieter, more prudent reality. Risk was something to avoid rather than embrace. Families lived modestly, content in their ability to plan, to endure, and to rest in the assurance that the state would provide a safety net. Everyday life took on a rhythm shaped by these changes. Mornings began with children walking to school along pavements that had been repaired by municipal projects. Work followed predictable hours, punctuated by tea breaks and small errands. Evenings returned to homes where heating was more reliable and where medical support was just a short walk or bus ride away. Sundays, once a time dominated by laborious chores or anxiety about the coming week, began to be measured in leisure, reading, knitting, or quiet walks in parks that were maintained by local councils. Security allowed a focus on comfort rather than survival. The impact of these measures was felt unevenly, of course. Some towns and cities lagged behind others in providing housing or health care. Some families received less support due to bureaucratic oversight or simple geography. And yet, across the country, the perception of a social safety net transformed expectations. Young people grew up assuming that care would be available in sickness, that pensions would support grandparents, that housing would not disappear overnight. Fear, once a constant companion, receded. Life felt safer, though not entirely predictable. Cultural life reflected these changes as well. Libraries, local halls, and community centers were supported by municipal funding, giving families spaces for recreation, learning, and communal gatherings. Cinema tickets became affordable, and radio programs, soon followed by television, offered shared experiences without demanding large sums of money. Small pleasures previously unavailable to many due to cost or class became accessible. The welfare state did not promise luxury, but it promised participation, a place in society where the ordinary citizen could live without constant crisis. One of the most profound effects of the welfare state was psychological. Generations of Britons had carried anxiety as a matter of course. Illness, unemployment, housing insecurity, and old age loomed as unspoken threats. Slowly, these anxieties softened. People could plan farther ahead, think about education for their children, contemplate home improvements, or even take small holidays. Risk was not eliminated, but it was measured differently. The sense of precariousness that had defined daily life for centuries began to recede. This quiet transformation extended into politics and daily discourse. Conversations in homes and workplaces shifted from survival to quality. Debates were no longer solely about immediate need, but about fairness, access, and civic responsibility. For many, this created a sense of belonging, a reassurance that society, collectively, could manage the uncertainties of life. The welfare state became an invisible partner in every household, shaping behavior, expectations, and priorities. Even as the decades progressed, families adapted without fanfare. NHS hospitals expanded, council estates grew, pensions increased, and new programs emerged for education and child welfare. Each layer of provision built upon the last, consolidating the sense of stability. People lived their lives in a steady rhythm, hardly noticing the breadth of the system that now supported them. Security, once unimaginable, became the normal condition of life. Yet there was also a subtle cultural tension. Some longed for the old vitality that came from risk, ambition, and striving. Others embraced the new calm, valuing continuity over drama. The welfare state was neither perfect nor universally celebrated, but it shaped the collective imagination, teaching the population that life could be ordinary, predictable, and still meaningful. Work, home, family, and leisure acquired a cadence that was deliberate, measured, and reassuring. Over time, this new normal defined generations. Children who grew up with health care and schooling available to all came to take these provisions for granted. Grandparents could age with dignity, and parents could plan lives without constant fear. Society, in quiet ways, became less fractious, more predictable, and more measured. Ambition persisted, but it was now balanced against expectation, prudence, and the certainty of support. In retrospect, the slow arrival of the welfare state did not produce dramatic headlines or heroic narratives. It did not inspire songs or grand speeches. Instead, it transformed life in the quiet, almost invisible spaces of daily routine. Kitchens, bedrooms, workplaces, and streets were subtly reshaped. The ordinary rhythms of life became easier, safer, and more manageable. Families could rest in the knowledge that there was at last a system designed to protect them through sickness, age, and hardship. And so the new normal settled over Britain like a gentle tide, not loud, not sudden, but persistent. A society structured not only.
Life in Britain by the mid-20th century had acquired a rhythm that was neither remarkable nor urgent. Wars had come and gone. Empires had expanded and receded. Innovations had arrived and settled into domestic routine. Yet through all of these disruptions, ordinary life continued with a quiet, almost mechanical persistence. The country moved forward, but not with ceremony or dramatic punctuation. It moved forward with the slow, repetitive rhythm of everyday living. People woke in their homes, prepared breakfasts, and went about work or school. Streets were busy with trams, buses, and cars, yet movement was familiar and predictable. Markets opened as they always had. Shops stocked goods. Families gathered for meals. The routines themselves gave life structure, regardless of what history might have declared extraordinary elsewhere. The post-war years brought reconstruction and adjustment. Cities bore the scars of bombing raids, yet brick by brick, street by street, repairs were made. Buildings were restored,
streets relaid, and public services rebuilt. Children played in parks still under partial repair. They learned to navigate scaffolding, cordoned off areas, and half-completed playgrounds. These were reminders of recent history, yet they did not define everyday experience. Life carried on in spite of them. Economic life, though constrained by rationing and austerity, was consistent. Families planned budgets, purchased goods as they became available, and maintained household routines. Meals were prepared in kitchens that smelled of coal fires and fresh bread. Clothes were mended, patched, and reused. People adapted to scarcity, learning how to make one resource stretch over many needs. Routine became a tool for survival, a method of containing uncertainty and maintaining the continuity of domestic life. Education, too, followed a steady cadence. Schools reopened, curriculums adjusted for the post-war generation, and children returned to lessons in mathematics, reading, geography, and history. Teachers, often themselves shaped by wartime experience, emphasized punctuality, discipline, and repetition. Learning occurred not only in classrooms, but in the rhythms of getting to school, lining up, reciting lessons, and returning home. The pattern itself became as important as the content. Workplaces echoed this same rhythm. Factories that had once produced munitions or industrial goods reverted to civilian production. Offices processed paperwork. Shops served customers. Labor was organized by time, schedule, and expectation. People arrived, performed their tasks, and departed. The intensity of wartime effort receded, replaced by a quieter, procedural diligence. The workday imposed structure on the larger uncertainties of the world. Transport likewise continued on familiar patterns. Trains ran on schedules, buses stopped at stations, and cars navigated streets and roads in orderly progression. Punctuality mattered. Delays occurred, but they were absorbed into the established routine, not dramatized. People learned to expect minor disruptions and to adapt with patience, understanding that life's continuity did not depend on perfection, only on perseverance. Entertainment and leisure offered structured respite. Cinemas showed films. Radio broadcasts filled evenings with music, news, and serialized stories. People attended local events, village fetes, church services, and community dances. These were familiar rituals, repeated across weeks and months. They provided small pleasures, a sense of normality, and a quiet reassurance that life could persist without extraordinary intervention. Health and domestic well-being maintained their steady course. Clinics and hospitals operated routinely. Vaccinations, medical checkups, and treatment of illness continued without the drama that had marked wartime crises. Families learned to monitor their own health with habitual vigilance, washing, heating, proper nutrition, and rest. Life's fundamentals, the body, the household, the neighborhood, remained the anchors of experience. Technology had become part of daily life, yet without spectacle. Electricity illuminated homes, trams and buses facilitated transport, telephones connected people over distance. These innovations were tools integrated into routines rather than celebrated as marvels. They facilitated continuity, allowing domestic and civic life to proceed with greater efficiency, but without demanding emotional recognition. Civic structures operated with quiet reliability. Local councils maintained streets, sanitation, and public facilities. Police ensured order. Public libraries and community halls offered learning and recreation. Procedures were followed, documents processed, and responsibilities carried out. Citizens rarely witnessed the machinery of governance in motion, yet they benefited from its persistence, which formed the unseen scaffolding of daily life. Community and social bonds were maintained through repeated interaction. Neighbors greeted one another, shared meals, and participated in local events. Children formed friendships on streets, in schools, and in playgrounds. Adults exchanged information, advice, and support. These connections were ordinary, repeated, and dependable, forming the invisible network that sustained the social fabric through continuity rather than crises. Political change, though ongoing, rarely intruded directly into daily life. Elections were held, policies debated, and representatives chosen, but these events occurred within a framework of continuity. Decisions made in Parliament might influence public services, taxes, or trade, yet the ordinary citizen experienced these impacts incrementally as adjustments in daily routine rather than as disruptive drama. Even the memory of war, empire, and national transformation existed more as backdrop than as immediate experience. Monuments, street names, and commemorations reminded citizens of what had occurred, but they did not interrupt the sequence of ordinary actions. Adults carried stories of past upheavals. Children learned of them in classrooms. Yet these memories were integrated into the cadence of domestic and civic life, shaping identity subtly rather than forcing reflection or emotion. Life's passage was measured in domestic cycles, waking and sleeping, cooking and eating, going to work, returning home. Seasonal changes structured experience, planting and harvesting, holidays and festivals. Weather, often unpredictable, imposed its own rhythm, shaping activities and mood. Within these cycles, the nation moved forward quietly, incrementally, without spectacle. Society's expectations were similarly restrained. Success and achievement were measured in small steps: a promotion at work, a well-kept home, a child's progress at school. National or global events provided context, but did not dominate the individual's sense of accomplishment. Life's markers were local, immediate, and repetitive, reinforcing the gentle persistence of routine. Economic recovery, technological innovation, and social reform progressed gradually. Housing projects, new schools, and infrastructure improvements arrived in increments. Each small change was absorbed into existing routines. People adapted without disruption. Life's continuity was maintained not by dramatic transformation, but by quiet adaptation to incremental change. Cultural life continued along familiar paths. Newspapers, periodicals, and books offered information and entertainment. Local theaters staged plays. Radio and increasingly television offered shared stories and experiences. These media provided background and diversion, sustaining imagination and knowledge without imposing urgency or spectacle. Children's lives were guided by habitual patterns. School, homework, chores, play, and family routines formed the framework of growing up. The passing of time was marked less by historical events than by personal and domestic cycles: birthdays, seasonal festivals, school terms, and family gatherings. These repetitions instill the sense of continuity and reliability. For adults, the repetition of domestic, civic, and occupational duties reinforced stability. Work, meal preparation, shopping, household management, and social interaction repeated with subtle variations. Life proceeded along these predictable lines, uninterrupted by distant crises or abstract historical change. Continuity itself became the primary measure of stability. The landscape of the nation, cities, towns, villages, and countryside reflected this continuity. Streets were maintained, homes repaired, and fields tended. Public spaces were cleaned, gardens cultivated, and communal areas preserved. Nature,